So, good afternoon, bon après-midi. Aujourd'hui, je vous parlerai en anglais. Pourtant, si vous avez des questions en français, je peux essayer d'y répondre. Alors, pour vous ici dans la chambre et sur la ligne. Before starting, I'd also like to thank the conference organizers, the Canadian Institute of Resource Law and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I'd also like to recognize the contributions of the other presenters. It's daunting and humbling to be presenting among such subject matter experts, but I'll sort of do my best not to actually humble myself up here. But anyway. So, to provide you with a sort of roadmap for the presentation, Section 1 is going to introduce the interconnections between the shipping sector, sustainable development, and climate change. Section 2 will explore the reason for the sector's exclusion under the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. Section 3 will introduce the International Maritime Organization as the UN body that has assumed responsibility for regulating emissions from international shipping. And Section 4 will identify current and proposed IMO measures to regulate shipborne emissions. It will then use a structured analysis to evaluate the effectiveness of proposed market-based measures to control emissions from shipping. And then Section 5 will conclude by offering an opinion on the policy best suited to regulate shipborne emissions and achieve the objective underlying the UN Framework Convention. So the international shipping sector plays a role in facilitating global trade, economic development, and poverty reduction. And to the extent that sustainability, which is defined as development which meets the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, to the extent that that definition encompasses a environmental, economic, social, and cultural dimension, arguably international shipping has been fairly instrumental in facilitating sustainable development internationally. And you see that in countries that have sort of leveraged trade and export led growth to fuel their development. And probably the most prominent example of that would be China. Yet, notwithstanding this sort of contribution to global development, the shipping industry does not operate without environmental impacts. Rather, impacts in the form of carbon emissions do have the ability to compromise the sector's contribution to sustainable development. So to provide some numbers for that, international shipping is the least emissions-intensive method of transporting goods internationally. It generates 3 to 8 grams of greenhouse gases per ton kilometer. And this is put in perspective when you contrast it with road and air transportation, which respectively generate 80 and 435 grams of greenhouse gases per ton kilometer. So notwithstanding this high efficiency, absolute emissions from the international shipping sector are significant. So between 2007 and 2012, on average, the shipping sector generated 866 million tons of greenhouse gases. And to put this in perspective, if the shipping industry's emissions were counted among state parties to the UN Framework Convention, in today's terms, that emission sum would put the shipping sector as the 7th largest emitter globally, so behind Germany at 909 million tons, but before Canada at 704 million tons. And those last numbers were 2015 numbers. And then significantly, emissions from international shipping are projected to increase between 50 and 250% between the present date and 2050. So really the bottom line, in light of what we all know about climate change, is despite the shipping sector's role in facilitating global development, despite its low emissions intensity and despite its relative efficiency relative to other forms of transportation, the sector's absolute contributions to global emissions and projected increases in those contributions confirmed that developing a comprehensive global plan to stabilize atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations will require this sector's participation. However, as this presentation will elaborate on, shipping sector emissions are not yet covered by international climate agreements. So as everybody in this room and on the line is likely familiar with, in 1992, I think most of the world's countries came together and entered into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which would provide the architecture in which they negotiate binding emission reduction targets. And under that convention, state parties would assume responsibility for the emissions generated within their territories. But several distinct obstacles prevented applying this model in the marine context. So the first, and probably the most obvious, is that emissions generated on the high seas are sort of beyond the geographical boundaries of any one state, so it makes it difficult to allocate them to one state. The second is the legal system of ship ownership and registration makes it very difficult to allocate those emissions to a state. So a ship owner may be located in one state, the ship may be registered or flagged in another state, and the flag state is really the country that's responsible for regulating the ship. The ship's charterer may belong to yet another state, and then the ship's operating company may belong to another state. So it's a truly almost cosmopolitan industry, and that makes it extremely difficult to fit those emission reductions or fit those emissions within the UN Framework Convention. And another barrier that has been quite really which led to the exclusion of shipping emissions has been the tension between the UN Framework Convention principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and the IMO principle of no more favorable treatment. So the CBDR principle basically is that states have common interest in taking action to combat climate change, but in light of different historical contributions to environmental degradation, developing countries have really differentiated responsibilities or greater responsibilities. But under the IMO sort of regulatory framework, all ships are treated equally and there's no discrimination between ships regardless of the state of registration. So you see there's a little bit of a tension there. And in fact, if you look at the states to which most of the world's shipping are registered, they are mostly developing countries. So states like Liberia, Panama, and the Marshall Islands, those are the largest country where the ships are registered in the world. So that's kind of the conflict. So those obstacles led to emissions from the shipping sector's exclusion under the UN Framework Convention, under the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and under the Paris Agreement in 2015. But Article 2.2 of the Kyoto Protocol noted that the task of regulating emissions from this sector would fall to the International Maritime Organization, which is the UN body responsible for regulating shipping. So since 1958, the IMO has served as the UN body responsible for regulating the safety and security of shipping and the prevention of marine pollution by ships. Its membership structure is quite unique, and it accommodates participation by flag states, by coastal states, and also by non-governmental organizations, which may be industry groups and environmental groups. It typically operates on a consensus basis, but sometimes things are passed by majority. In 1997, the IMO amended the Marine Pollution Convention to address air emissions from ships. However, they didn't define pollutant to include carbon dioxide, really reflecting the understanding of that particulate of the time. But they did adopt a resolution that said they would work to address emissions from shipping. So that's really when the IMO commenced their work in regulating shipping in 1997. And since that time, they've commissioned probably 3 studies, and they've developed 2 mandatory efficiency-based instruments, and they've put forward 2 market-based instruments, which this presentation will engage with and consider. But there's still quite a lot of work to be done, obviously. So I apologize for the very small text up on the screen. There's no need to read that, and if you want to engage with the subject matter more fully, the paper is online. But basically, the first measure is called the Energy Efficiency Design Index. So it's a technical performance measure. It requires all new ships of prescribed classes that are size 400 gross tons and above to meet a minimum threshold for energy efficient design. And this is usually through measures such as optimized hull form and dimensions, lightweight construction, hybrid drive propulsion systems, and that sort of thing. So it's a technical measure. The EEDI reference level represents a minimum energy efficiency per capacity mile, and it is expressed in grams of CO2. And it's designed to be tightened incrementally over time with 10, 20, and 30% reductions between 2015, 2020, and 2030. So the system contains elements of the output-based allocation discussed by Professor Masher in the Alberta oil context. So it's quite similar, except there doesn't seem to be any obligation to pay for emissions over and above that threshold. Oh, sorry. So the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, that's more for operational measures. So what that looks like, it's putting in place a plan to ensure that as the ship's operating, it's done so in a way that's energy efficient. So that involves measures like slow steaming, just-in-time arrival, optimal voyage planning, and those types of measures. So both of those energy efficiency measures are in place. They've been in place and adopted in Canadian law since 2013. And that's just an example of one if anybody's interested. It's a little wacky, to be honest. It looks like a sail attached to a sort of merchant vessel, but apparently it reduces fuel consumption by 15 to 10% in ideal conditions. If I was a crew member, I might be a little skeptical if the captain asked me to put that up, but I guess you do what you're told as crew. But most of what I guess the shipping industry has seen is larger size ships with smaller engines. So that's enabled them to meet those efficiency targets. So the next sort of market-based targets that have been put forward would be a global emissions trading system. And this really mirrors a cap and trade system applied in the marine context. So that's what they're thinking there. They'd set a cap, and then ship owners and operators can trade emissions allowances to the extent that their emissions fall above or below the cap. The International Fund for GHG Emissions from Ships is really to establish a system where ship owners or ship operators would pay a set fee per every ton of bunker fuel they've used. That fee would go into a greenhouse gas emission fund, and it would be used to fund adaptation and mitigation projects around the world, primarily focusing on developing countries, and it would also be used to fund in-sector efficiency and innovation projects. And the price per ton of fuel would be structured to meet an emission reduction target, and to the extent that the sector as a whole does not achieve that target, then ship owners could purchase in or out of sector emission reduction credits. So the development of these measures has currently been placed on hold. And the remainder of the presentation is going to focus on evaluating the effectiveness of each of those 2 market-based measures. And I limit the analysis to the market-based measures for a few reasons, due to the timing of the presentation, the fact that the efficiency measures are already in place, And most importantly, the fact that the IMO has acknowledged that as efficiency-based measures, they're not going to position the sector to meet the emission reduction targets that are required. And as efficiency measures, sometimes there can be a compounding effect where the more efficient something is, the more it's used, and it actually generates more emissions. So to evaluate the effectiveness of these policies, I used a structured analysis using the factors that are indicated above. So we have environmental effectiveness, cost effectiveness, incentives for positive technological change, practical feasibility of implementation, legal enforcement, and developing country impacts. The factors 1 to 4 are sort of based on IMO literature, and then factors 5 and 6 are my own, and they relate to exploring the sort of legal and political feasibility of implementing the measures. So on the environmental effectiveness side, the Greenhouse Gas Fund and the Emission Trading Scheme are fairly evenly matched in terms of emission reduction potential, imposition of an industry-wide cap, application to all ships, dual effect of incentivizing low-carbon innovations and mobilizing funding for mitigation adaptation projects, and access to out-of-sector emissions. In terms of differences in performance, the Greenhouse Gas Fund outperforms the Emission Trading Scheme in the sense that it can apply to ships that are not parties to the IMO. So if a non-party ship comes into a port and docks at a bunker fuel supplier that's required to adhere to these regulations, then that non-party state would still be required to pay the greenhouse gas levy. And the real weaknesses would be the risk of a price increase and then a modal shift to other forms of transportation. So if, depending on the sort of, if the price goes up and then people rely on other forms of transportation that are more emissions intensive, it can have an effect that's kind of inconsistent with its purpose of preventing emissions. In terms of cost effectiveness, both policies give ship owners or operators maximum latitude to pursue whatever measures they wish to attempt to limit their emissions. So they're both very good from that perspective. They both enable access to out-of-sector emission reduction opportunities. So that's another way of keeping costs low. And again, here the Greenhouse Gas Fund, when it comes to administrative costs, is seen to be a lot more administratively straightforward and less costly than establishing the emissions trading system. And that's largely due to the fact that many of the obligations under the Greenhouse Gas Fund dovetail with obligations that are already in place. So for example, bunker fuel suppliers are already required to collect information on the volume of fuel consumed, the quality of that fuel, and sort of relay it to the IMO. So the same thing would essentially occur with the Greenhouse Gas Fund, but in addition to that information, they would be collecting an additional surcharge, which would be put to the Greenhouse Gas Fund. And to apply numbers to this, the IMO estimates gross administrative costs of the Greenhouse Gas Fund policy to equal 8 to 11 billion in 2020 and 15 to 25 billion in 2030. And you can contrast this with the emissions trading system, which has estimated administrative costs of 24 to 27 billion in 2020 and 40 to 49 billion in 2030. So there is a significant difference there. And the primary cost associated with establishing the Greenhouse Gas Fund program would be actually establishing the fund. So something that sort of mirrors the Fonds Vert here in Quebec that would take the money and allocate it to appropriate projects. But there is a good international precedent for that in something called the International Oil Pollution Fund, which basically takes contributions from oil importing states, put it into a central insurance and compensation fund, which can be accessed if there's ever an oil pollution event. So that's been in place since 1971. So if the IMO were looking at pursuing this opportunity, it could provide a good precedent. And in terms of incentives for positive technological change, as non-prescriptive goal-based policies, both the Greenhouse Gas Fund and the emissions trading system really reward an infinite number of measures to reduce emissions. There's one thing identified in the research or there's some suggestion that the Greenhouse Gas Fund would provide greater certainty around the pricing of emissions, which would better incentivize ship owners and operators to sort of make those investments. So that is one thing that came up in the research. In terms of practical feasibility of implementation and legal enforcement, the major challenge with the Greenhouse Gas Fund would be setting up the actual fund. The major challenge with the emissions trading system would be setting up that system. The actual enforcement of the regulations at the ship and fuel supplier level would be fairly easy because the sort of regulatory channels through which that would take place are already in place under the Marine Pollution Convention. And in terms of impacts on developing countries, both policies appear to be in a position to reconcile the common but differentiated responsibility principle and the no more favorable treatment principle, in that funds from either the ETS or the GHG fund can be allocated to projects in developing countries. In the ETS context, it will really depend whether emission allowances are auctioned or sold. And to conclude on that analysis, it suggests that the Greenhouse Gas Fund policy is better positioned to regulate emissions sector due to its greater coverage of the world fleet, lower administrative costs flowing from close overlap with existing regulatory procedures, anticipated greater certainty in carbon pricing, and also industry has expressed a preference for this policy. So from a political perspective, it may be easier to get through. So in April 2018, quite recently, the IMO adopted what it called its initial strategy on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships, which articulates its goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2050 relative to 2008 levels. So the strategy's centerpiece involves continued improvements to efficiency through tightening the Energy Efficiency Design Index, and the strategy contemplates considering adopting market-based measures at a later time. But the IMO target to reduce absolute emissions from shipping by 50% relative to 2008 levels falls short of the target expressed in the IPCC's recent SR15 report, which recommends that global emissions decrease 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2030. So I'm confident that the IMO is not alone in having their targets fall short of those recommended by the IPCC. However, the discrepancy should motivate the organization to consider adding market-based measures as part of its policy toolkit rather than focusing exclusively on efficiency-based measures. The analysis in my research suggests that of the market-based measures currently before the IMO, the Greenhouse Gas Fund is best positioned to reduce sectoral emissions. And to overcome some of the political barriers which have been demonstrated to accompany carbon pricing regimes, domestically and internationally, issues which the IMO may wish to devote its attention to include really studying and containing potential adverse impacts on developing countries, such as import or export exposed economies. So the purpose of this analysis would be to ensure that the shipping role in advancing sustainability through global trade is not damaged or offset through carbon regulation. So investigating literature on the progressiveness or regressiveness of the levy as between low-income and high-income economies may be a good place to start to obtain more clarity and comfort on this point. The second point is the IMO could consider the ways in which the Greenhouse Gas Fund could be directed to emissions mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries, sort of gauging and responding to the insights and preferences of the developing countries and developed countries that will ultimately be called upon to ratify the policy. And third, the IMO could build enforcement capacity among many of the developing states who are the flag states for the world's shipping, and who will ultimately be called upon to force the regulation. And fourth, the IMO could study the design of green funds established internationally and around the world, looking to identify best practices, maximize fiscal efficiency, and develop criteria for the design of adaptation and mitigation projects. So that's really that's my presentation. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.